So this is a Hollywood Reporter article, and it says Back to the Future writer asks Universal to destroy censored version of the sequel. So Bob Gale says neither he nor director Robert Zemeckis knew the Netflix stream version existed. Says Bob Gale is asking fans not to pee too hard on Netflix for a censored version of Back to the Future Part 2, which was streamed for a short while. Fans of the series were irate when they discovered a tiny portion of the 1989 sequel was changed poorly. It has since been replaced with the standard version. Now, Dave, did you know about this? Because we reviewed this movie and we reviewed the Netflix version of this movie just last week. And had you caught this error in the movie? Were you aware of this?
It's weird because I felt like there was something that wasn't quite right, but I couldn't really put my finger on it. And what's actually censored in it, you could miss pretty easily. I'll be honest with you, it's one of those things that to me it didn't terribly affect the storytelling, and I'm not such a I love the Back to the Future movies. I own them, and I've watched them quite a bit. But I have watched the first one the most, and I have watched Part 3, the one we're talking about tonight. I have watched that one the most. The one that's in the middle, I like the one that takes place in sort of the dark, twisted 80s. But it's not one that I have revisited a lot over the years. The two that I have always watched the most has been Part 3, which I think is just a great, time travel, steampunk, like adventure movie. It's a great Back to the Future movie, but it's just a great movie, period. But we're going to get to that soon enough. But the original one, the first one, is the one I have watched the most. I think I would have more likely caught something from the first one than from Part 2, because my understanding is that it was Part 2 is the one that has the censored moment in it, because apparently it involves the magazine, because they actually have cut out something or changed something with the Ooh La La magazine, if I remember correctly. And I'll be honest with you, it didn't really. I didn't really catch it, and I was fully paying attention. But also, too, as just previously discussed, when they mentioned it, I was like, oh, yeah, Richard Hurt was in Quantum Leap. But I don't remember all the specific details about that episode. So
apparently, and this is a quote from Bob Gale, it says, apparently this was a foreign version, which neither director Robert Zemeckis nor he even knew existed. For some country that had a problem with the Ooh La La magazine cover. that was the scene that was edited. He said, yeah, I asked that the studio destroy this version. FYI, Netflix does not edit films. They only run the versions that are supplied to them. So they're blameless. If you can direct your ire at Universal, but I think they will be a lot more careful in the future and with the future. So I just wanted to mention this because neither of us caught this error, but a lot of fans did. And, the writer has come back and said this version actually should be destroyed. This is a foreign version of the film that they did not approve, and he wants it axed, and it's not Netflix's fault. It's Universal's fault.
And I'll bring this up. Certain countries, they have certain sort of their quote-unquote decency standards. That for a lot of things. And I know that, for example, when Lynn Workman and I were self-publishing Bushi Tales. Now, Bushi is just another term for samurai. When we were doing Bushi Tales, it involves the main characters are 4 female samurai and are sent on a quest by Hachiman, the Japanese god of war. I was sending out packages because when we initially were selling the series and making it available for people, we had a lot of servicemen and women overseas purchasing these books, which was really great because we had some really great coverage in Stars and Stripes, which is the military's newspaper. And so I was very excited about it. But I had a couple destinations. I was having a heck of a time actually getting packages to people, and they would never arrive. And then it turned out the reason is because Akio, which is our main character, which if you see her from Bushi Tales, she's fully clothed. She's not showing any skin. but her hair isn't covered. And apparently, because she was on this envelope and because the countries we were sending these packages to, they were basically being screened and destroyed before they even got to who they were supposed to get to. And so I learned that even though I didn't consider, bushy tails, quote unquote porn, or like Playboy or anything, for certain cultures and certain religious beliefs, I guess it is. So we just would put it in a basic mailer with no extra stuff on it, because we were putting a decal of Akio on there, because I always like to do extra stuff, and I was like, well, if we don't do that, perhaps it'll get through. And then the packages started getting through. So you never know what certain people will unfortunately find offense with. But I respect all the different cultures and religious beliefs, so I don't want to seem cold-hearted about it. But I've experienced my own weird form of that, where certain people objected to certain things that I didn't think were necessarily indecent. So, but everyone's perspective is unique to themselves. So.
Well, I always believe in allowing the creator the maximum amount of freedom possible, and so I'm anti-censorship. So I'm just glad that they're getting their version back as it should be on Netflix. And I apologize that I myself did not note the error.
Well, I didn't note it, but that's just because for me it's not something I was focused on, and I didn't even catch it, to be honest with you. I'm not tuning in to Back to the Future for some kind of a salacious, whatever it supposedly, was. I don't know. So I think that's why I didn't catch it. It's not something that I specifically was looking for. And like I said, Back to the Future Part 2, that's the one I've watched the least. I would have been more likely to miss something probably from Part 3 or Part 1. So.
Well, Peggy mentions that it's good to know that Netflix doesn't edit, because I think there's a lot of people that wonder about that. She says, I know that PBS does for shows, so that's interesting. And actually, it's kind of interesting that you mentioned that, Peggy, because I actually recall being quite young and seeing some rather racy things on PBS because it wasn't edited. So it's kind of, I'm curious if that's changed, because I'm not a huge PBS guy now, although I do enjoy programs from time to time on PBS. In fact, I actually watch, what is it? It's the one about Queen Victoria. I think it might just be called The Queen. I've watched that a couple times on PBS. And I used to watch Doctor Who on PBS when I was very young. That's actually where all my Doctor Who knowledge comes from, is from watching it on PBS. But that's interesting to know if they actually do censor some of their programming, possibly kind of like what you were saying, Dave, reversed, where things over there would be considered acceptable for television, but they're not considered acceptable perhaps here in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, it's just you never know. Different cultures have different touch points and because of their various religious beliefs, where they might take offense to something that we here wouldn't think would be a big deal. So I totally understand that, and we
actually got a good discussion about this going here in the Rogues Gallery. Amanda Sand says, now that CG post editing has become so easy, it seems like these little edits are becoming more and more frequent as filmmakers or distributors try to cater to more markets and their constraints. And I think that's absolutely, you've hit the nail on the head there, Amanda Sand. That's absolutely, with digital editing, it makes it much easier to do these kinds of things and to do these little switcheroos, and people don't notice. Like I said, we didn't notice, and I consider myself and I consider Dave pretty good observers, and we're pretty big fans of pop culture, and we've been involved with the creative process and all that stuff, and so it's easy for that stuff to kind of be missed, So I think that you're right. I think that in this, as you said, the CG post editing world, it is becoming easier and easier to do that. Although it sounds like in this particular situation, this was a rather old edit. For some, God knows who, for God knows where, that kind of thing. And it just happens to be the version that Universal gave Netflix.
Well, and it's interesting because all I could think of is that Universal was thinking, well, let's give them the most easily accessible, version. that they consider the most, would have the most appeal to a broader audience, to avoid any kind of even remote controversy, I would assume. But no, yeah, I don't. It's interesting. And then Peggy brings up a comment, and I guess she's touching on what I was talking about earlier about the distribution problems I was having with sending Bushy Tails out. And she says, and you did the research and found out what was happening. Well, I had to. It was costing money. I guess the directors didn't think to look into distribution issues. And, when you're a Hollywood director, I would think to an extent you probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about distribution issues. When you're an independent publisher, you think about everything because, if a product isn't getting to someone and you're constantly having to put it back in the mail, it's costing you money. And a lot of times, independent comic books specifically, there's not a lot of profit there to begin with. So I needed to find out what was wrong. And I also wanted to make sure that those people that wanted to get those stories, that wanted to read them, I want to make sure they get them, I want to make sure they're entertained. That as a comic book storyteller, that's my job, is hopefully to entertain you, lift you out of your experiences or what you have going on, transport you to another amazing, magical place and have a totally different experience and hopefully want to come back for more. That's my job. So if you're not getting the book, I can't even begin to transport you, So no, yeah, it was a weird thing. I had no idea. And it made me a little bit more sensitive to some of the things that we were doing. And we did make some interesting, different creative choices moving forward with different things when we realized that it was a problem. Because like I said, it was primarily affecting those servicemen and women overseas who were wanting to actually receive Bushy Tails. And luckily enough, there was quite a few of them. We were very blessed in that sense. Bobby Chambers says, do you think this is something we will start to see more often, especially with older films? And I'm assuming we're talking about censorship. Well, there's a lot of talk about that. The people are curious about what's going to happen with Disney Plus. When Disney Plus rolled out, there's a lot of films people consider to be have moments or characters or scenes that they consider racially insensitive, for example. People are curious to see if they're going to take those moments out, just edit them right out, if they're going to try and change something, put something in place of it. And then at the end of the day, for most of the films, what Disney did is they just put out a warning, a disclaimer at the front that just tried to help people to have a cultural perspective, for when the film came out. Along these lines, talking about that, I'll never quite forget the first time that I watched the Batman movie serials, the ones that came out in the 40s, because it is very anti-Japanese. It's so weird because there's a radio drama that actually talks about what's happening in the war. And, feelings were very, very harsh at that point in time. And I remembered it started a conversation with me and my mom about, why is it like this? Because I couldn't understand at that young age, exactly what I was seeing. And my mom had to explain to me what had happened. And what that does is that tells me is that sometimes maybe we don't need to censor things. Maybe we just need to use it as an opportunity to explain to people and teach them about something that happened in the past. Perhaps we can learn from those moments in time and maybe grow and become hopefully a better, more well-rounded person because of it. Because I didn't realize until my mom was talking about it, everything that had been going on, with the relocation camps and everything. And I didn't realize any of that had gone on. But the way I learned about it was not in history class in school. It was actually because of a conversation I had with my mom because of the Batman movie serials. So just because something is offensive, just because something is unfortunate, just because something is a product of its time, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily evil nor wrong. It depends, as with all things, the context that you give it. And, if you can use it as an opportunity to teach and educate, and help people learn from a moment in time, learn from a mistake, hopefully, and make better choices. I think there's something to be said for that as well.
There's absolutely something to be said for that as well. I mean, that's the entire point, to me, because, it's subjective to say whether that particular serial is a good story or not, but it's objective to say it is a product of its times and reflects its times. That's an objective statement. You know what I mean? As opposed to a subjective statement as, is it any good? You know what I mean?
Well,
There's a difference there. There's a huge difference between that. But
yeah.
there is another side to this that's a little bit more benign that Peggy brings up, because we're talking about PBS specifically, and she says, I don't think PBS edits it for censor issues, but for time or something like that. And so scenes for their mysteries like Sherlock are missing, and that's a possibility as well. That the time sometimes, especially when you talk about international markets, sometimes the allotment for a particular show is different than it is here. So, for instance, in some jurisdictions, they don't have commercials. So the amount of time that they have something on is different. Now, PBS doesn't have that problem because PBS doesn't have commercials either. But things like that do happen where programming is edited simply because of timing issues, for time issues. It has nothing to do with actual censorship. And that's a good point. In fact, what's interesting to me is there's a number of interesting television edits of classic movies like Dune, Aliens, that I would argue the television version is better than the theatrical version because they actually added scenes because they had more time to fill, where it actually went in the opposite direction. So that does happen. It happens both ways. Things get cut, but sometimes they'll even add things for a television broadcast, especially in different markets and things like that. So that's also kind of interesting. That happens sometimes too. And James helped me, by the way. Victoria is the show I was talking about. The Queen is on Netflix. Victoria is the one that's on PBS. And thank you for helping me with that, because actually I think Victoria is a really good show. I've never watched The Queen on Netflix, so I don't really want to promote something that I've never watched, but Victoria on PBS, I actually do enjoy quite a bit.
Well, I can chime in on The Queen on Netflix and say that my wife and I thoroughly enjoyed it and highly recommend it, especially for those of you who like things like Downton Abbey or sort of British drama. I found it to be interesting. And we found ourselves fact-checking a lot. And that's the thing that's also interesting. We found ourselves fact-checking what was going on. Did that really happen? Was that really like that? And what's interesting about it is it ends up being a history lesson for us because, we don't know that much about what's happening in the British Empire. And we're pulling up and going, what do you know? What do you know about that? What do you know? So again, another teaching moment within television, depending upon how you look at it.
Well, James mentions that Batman was a tad racist in those serials, and by a tad, I mean a lot.
Yes. And that was what I was trying to make, because I was telling my mom, I was like, what in the heck is going on? But it was also one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life, too, because that is the most, and not just racially insensitive, just humanly insensitive Batman I've ever seen in my life, too. One of my favorite moments in that is Batman is fighting these, they're like sort of like zombies, like radium, like mentally controlled zombie things or something. And Batman's tussling with one of them. They're super strong. And he pitches this Batman over the side, and Batman is falling to his death. That's how the cliffhanger ends. It's like, oh, is Batman going to live? And then the next chapter, it starts up. Batman's still falling with that back screen projection, I might add. He's still falling. And when he lands, he actually lands on a window washing, the little carriage things, the little things that go up and down on the windows. And he lands on it. And it's hilarious because he knocks both of those dudes on there off. They fall to their death. Batman does nothing for them, just climbs right back up to keep fighting those dudes on the roof. He couldn't care less about those two guys that fell to their death. So Batman was just humanly insensitive. And to weigh in on what you said earlier, Eric, it's like, whether it's not necessarily good, it was a bad story. The whole thing is just as an interesting moment in time as the first adaptation of Batman. It's a curiosity, but it's not very good to stretch the imagination. But it's
well, Peggy makes the bigger point, like I was talking about. She says, yes, Dave, use it as an opportunity to teach, which is what is so sad about this new world where we tell people they have to be politically correct, but not why. And that's a great insight, Peggy, because to me, being politically correct in a lot of ways is just about having good manners, but it's not spun that way. You know what I mean? And that's why you have to have the conversation, and you can't just sort of just jump to conclusions. That's the whole idea. Is that's why it's important to have these more meaningful conversations and not just sort of say whatever your little gut reaction is. Man of Sam says perhaps That's one reason why some fans value physical media copies of favorites, because they're unalterable and preserve what was already created. And man, Sam, there's tons of fans that believe that. There's a whole movement of fandom that prefers physical media over digital, and they make all sorts of points about that's why digital is always going to have problems because of the thing that we're talking about here. Because you're not going to ever have these definitive versions of the films anymore. I mean, a great example. I mean, we've been talking a lot about Star Wars. I mean, you think about like the special editions, and things like that, and that was done with the blessing and direction of the creator of the property, and he's massively changed the films. You know what I mean? Not to the point that I think the meaning of the films are changed, but very well in some scenes they're substantial. They actually do change the motivation of the characters. So, yeah, that is a great argument for why a lot of people like and prefer physical media.
And then Peggy chimes in and says the first time that I saw Highlander was the whole director's cut, and then was upset when I saw the theatrical release. Well, that's the thing. It's like sometimes these films can change quite a bit, especially with editing. And I mentioned to Eric earlier, I said talking about director's cuts and whatever, which we'll be mentioning hopefully something here in a little bit in the pop culture news segment of the Streaming Wars talking about this. But it's amazing how much something can be changed, and not just the intent, but the whole thing. Yes, Han shot first. James.
That's the scene I'm talking about, James. Totally changes the motivation of the character and totally changes the character. That's a problem. That is a problem. I don't care that he created it. He changed we could do a whole segment just on that. Just on that. But Chris Roberts, who we haven't heard much from tonight, he raised his hand. Physical media is far better. And Chris, I am a physical media guy as well. Although I've mentioned many times in this program, my collection really is not that substantial. I'm very selective in what I actually acquire, but I do prefer physical media over digital, personally.
And James Stone brings up yet another important, timely comment in reference to the Batman original movie serials. He says, wasn't that Robin like 30 years old, 38 years old? He probably was, James. He probably was. Robin is a great character in the comics and such a great character for animation. But when you start trying to take Robin and bring him into the real world, as much as I love Batman Forever, it gets problematic. It just does. It just does. So there you go. But yeah, he probably was 38 years old. He looked like he was 38 years old. So yeah, again, not championing that movie serial at all. Just saying, not championing it. You want to watch a great movie serial? I would recommend the Captain Marvel one. The Captain Marvel one is great. Or I would even recommend Zorro's Fighting Legion. Zorro's Fighting Legion is wonderful. Could highly, highly recommend that, especially for those of you who love Zorro. And I love Zorro. So Zorro's Fighting Legion is great. The Captain Marvel one gets a very big thumbs up from me. Even that crazy Captain America one with that opening scene with that guy on that motorcycle. Well, I'm sure somebody died filming it. Even that one's kind of slightly entertaining. The Batman one, I don't know. Jury's out.